Friday, and it's Andrew Keane. Let me make you be able to see him. There you go, Andrew.
Not only is it Friday, but it's September 11th.
Oh, September 11th.
You missed that one, Keith. An important day in American history, and perhaps September 11th, 2020 is a double bind. It's 2011 squared. In California, in the Bay Area, we've been living through the apocalypse. I just spoke to someone in Portland, the fires, people are evacuating the city. We had one day this week where day was night, so things are pretty surreal. And actually, Keith, for once, technology grounds us in reality. That was the week of September 11th, 2020, where it seems as if there's a new war forming, not between big tech and the rest of the world, but within big tech itself. Apple versus the rest. Is Apple now the voice of civilization, the voice against surveillance capitalism? They're the ones who have broken from the Google and Facebook and Amazons of the world?
Let me just turn off that weird screen first. Things are bubbling up. Apple actually is in the center of so many different things right now. Obviously, the whole thing with Epic, where the CEO of Epic this week tried to get the moral high ground above Apple. But the bigger story is Apple's intent to turn off the unique identifier that identifies a device you're using.
So like my iPhone, Mr. Apple, Mr. whoever's in control, you're doing me a favor. I don't want people watching what I'm doing.
So they're turning off. It's the I forget what it's called now. Something like the IF something. IF. I actually want to tell you what this is. It's the IDFA identifier, which basically is how they identify a device, and that's how they track you across sites, and they retarget you with really crappy ads. Like you've just bought a pair of shoes and you see the same pair of shoes 8 times that day, even though you've already bought them. So Apple said no more. We're going to block this, and only if consumers turn it back on consciously will you be able to do this. And Facebook is freaking out. And today the Instagram CEO went on CNBC aggressively saying he's going to be lobbying the whole industry to prevent Apple from doing this, so that, in his words, he can continue to serve consumers by serving them relevant ads, in quotes. So that,
I have to say, my immediate response to this is why it's taken Apple so long. I've known some senior people in Apple marketing who have often reached out to me because of my work. And I know that Tim Cook has always felt this very strongly, that the difference between Apple is that they're not a data company. They're not selling our data. They're selling products. So why has it taken them so long to be a little bit more explicit and actually declare war against the surveillance capitalist players, the other ones?
I don't know why it's taken them so long, but you're right. This is fundamentalism. This is religion. It is business models clashing.
Yeah.
The business model of Apple is hardware and subscriptions. The business model of Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp is it's free, but we get to target you. And both are business models that are transparent and legitimate. There's nothing evil, if you like, about these choices. I personally prefer Apple's model to Facebook's. But
you mean personally from a business point of view or as a user?
As a user. If I was an investor, I'd want to invest in both because they're both great models if they can do them. But it's fundamentalism. And here's the thing: Apple, from nowhere a few years ago, now has the lion's share of every mobile user in the United States. Not in every country, but in the US. And the US is by far and away the biggest tracking and advertising market. So Apple quite genuinely threatens the business models of Facebook and Instagram, and that is not overreacting. That's real.
And that's very healthy. I mean, I personally am surrounded as we speak with Apple products. I mean, I'm the ultimate Apple fanboy, apart from you and Steve Gilmore. And the reason I am is because of the privacy stuff. That's why that's why I don't have a Gmail account. Now, I'm not saying that there's someone in Google who's spying on all my emails. Obviously, things aren't that crude. But nonetheless, I trust Apple. And I think the core of this new war is about trust. And that's the most valuable thing in the digital world. People don't trust certainly Facebook and Google and Amazon, whereas they trust Apple.
I think that's true until you move the focus to the App Store.
Yeah, and then it goes. Then the shoe's on the other foot, right?
Yeah, and I actually think Apple's in the right there as well, as we all know if you watch this show. But certainly the mood is against Apple there, and you know. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram's side on some other issues. So this is a complex.
Yeah, it's complex, but I'm not sure I'm quite as well. I'm never quite as non-committal as you on this stuff. But if you had to bet on which of these business models will in the long run win out, I would bet on the Apple model. I mean, we've seen with your one of your other really interesting pieces this week from Barry Lynn in Harper that the left now, their focus in America is fighting the data monopolists, and they're fighting surveillance capitalism. So in the long run, I think the Apple model is way more viable than if you're in the startup business. If you're going to fund a company, or if you're an entrepreneur, you're much better off trying to create companies and products and platforms for the Apple world than the other world.
Yeah, well, you know, there's Apple and there's Android. We know that Android's the bigger platform measured by the number of users. Apple is vastly the bigger measured by the amount of revenue. What they're talking about in Harper's is a little bit different. They are complaining about the performance of Facebook, Google, and Amazon on all of these platforms, and saying that it is an extortion racket. And they go back in the history of civilization, basically, and they depict Bezos and Larry and Sergey and Zuckerberg as the new lords, and we are all the serfs. And they're having us basically work for nothing, contributing our time to them so they can make money.
This is not. I mean, Nick Carr wrote about this 15 years ago. I've written about it. Jaron Lanier's written about it. This is not exactly a new argument. What's interesting is that it's becoming mainstream now.
Mainstream, and especially of the left, which is interesting. The left does not believe that large companies are a good thing. And the more powerful they are, the worse they are, which goes back to the old Stalinist idea of monopoly capitalism. State monopoly capitalism was a term coined by Roosevelt.
I mean, there's a rich leftist tradition of hostility to monopoly capitalism, which is Stalinist. I mean, Stalinism is monopoly. It's not monopoly capitalism. It's just monopoly full stop.
Well, yeah, but if you do a keyword search on the collected works of Joseph Stalin, state monopoly capitalism comes up a lot. Because what they did is they shifted the focus of change from to big companies. They did, and they became nationalist. By the way, nationalist.
Okay, but
against big companies.
Only a conversation with Keith Teare will degenerate into a dispute over over Stalinism. Let's talk about digital media, Keith. Do you think that this antitrust movement on the left, and also to some extent on the right, is it real now? I mean, I've been suggesting it's real for the last decade, and I've been wrong so far, but I'm convinced that at some point it's going to become real. At some point it's going to acquire the political momentum so that it will start to fundamentally change the nature of the digital world, the digital business world?
I think it's already real. I mean, think about how many times we've seen Zuckerberg and others have to go to Congress to testify in front of committees.
Yeah.
That never really used to happen that much. Now it does, and most recently they were all there via Zoom, including Bezos.
Yeah.
And you know, politicians tend to glom on to what they conceive is popular. So that tells you that the radar in Washington, D.C. is that this is a good cause to jump on because it's now popular. And, you know, principles really go out the window. It's not about principles anymore. It's about popularity.
I mean, Barr announced some investigations of Google. Google is in the crosshairs of the Trump administration. Facebook, of course, everybody hates. What's interesting is Amazon's political mechanics of avoiding being the story. But at some point, this story is going to catch up to Bezos because he's the biggest of them all. He's the biggest beast in the jungle.
He is, but he still only has 1% of global retail and 4% of US online of US retail. So, you know, Amazon is a huge company, but a small part of GDP spent on retail.
Well, what about online retail, though, and particularly the
in the US
platform for resale?
In the US, it gets into the double-digit percents, 25-ish or something. But it's, you know, there's Walmart's still huge, all the Target's huge. There's lots of big players. None of them are as big as Amazon, granted, although Walmart is starting to challenge. And I think the key is the quality of the narrative against these companies is currently reduced down to name calling, finger pointing, and you're too big. If the quality of the narrative doesn't improve, I think there'll be lots of hearings, but nothing will happen.
Yeah, and I also think the other issue, which is the problem on the left, and the problem I've always found with this argument being on their side, is that most people really don't care. Most people are willing to give up a degree of privacy in exchange for the convenience of the Google search engine, in exchange for Instagram and Facebook, in exchange for Amazon Prime. Most consumers simply aren't bothered by this. They don't still see it as a fundamental assault on their privacy. So philosophers do, leftists do, but ordinary people don't. And unless they begin to realize that, it's never going to have the political traction of other issues.
No, you're completely right. And therein lies the problem for Facebook and Instagram and the others when it comes to Apple, because I'm happy to use Facebook and Instagram. I know I'm being tracked. I don't really care. But because I don't care, when Apple blocks them doing that, I won't care about that either. And Apple has the power to do that. So the consumer is definitely not going to rise up in support of Instagram in the way the CEO thinks it is from his interview today, because we don't care. What we care about is functionality. We care about convenience. We care about ease of use and connections to our family and our friends in the case of Facebook, to the photos that they're producing in the case of Instagram, to buy stuff and get stuff delivered in the case of Amazon. All of those more practical needs trump the other stuff. So I think that we want to keep using them, and Apple can block them without upsetting us for the same reason. So it doesn't really serve them very well that we don't care when they have an enemy that can do some damage to them. It only serves them when there is no enemy and no damage can be done.
Well, last week was also a particularly surreal one outside the climate crisis in the Bay Area and on the West Coast generally. One of the most surreal narratives of last week were the wild fluctuations in the stock market. Tesla up or down 20% in a day, lots of other strange things going on. And perhaps as one solution to this short-termism, on the market is Eric Ries's idea of a long-term stock exchange, which he launched. Eric Ries is highly respected in Silicon Valley. He is a genuinely long-term thinker. Does that have economic? I understand the intellectual attraction of a long-term stock exchange. Long-termism has always been an attractive idea to many people in Silicon Valley. There's even a long now bar in the Presidio, which is a fun place to go after the lockdown. But what is the economics of a long-term stock exchange, Keith?
Well, it's an attempt to place value on goals. Stock exchanges normally place value on short-term achievement against goals. And so the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange clearly do care about goals, but they care even more in terms of price on short-term progress. What Eric is saying is there are many goals, like climate change, for example, that aren't really measurable in the short term, but are still worth society banking on doing. And he wants a stock exchange that will value the goal and still have progress against goals, but measured over something far greater than a single quarter. It's interesting that he is a classic example of a type of issue that's coming up now, because there's another company called Carter that it's where if you do a startup, you store your cap table of all your shareholders, and they're launching Carter X, which is the ability of private companies that are not yet ready for the public markets to buy and sell shares, which is opening access to earlier to normal people to invest in future winners, which is kind of interesting. So Eric, with the long-term stock exchange, Carter X, a company I'm a shareholder in, Funderbeam, is doing that for the rest of the world in Singapore, London, and Estonia, led by a woman, Kaidi, who used to run the NASDAQ in Estonia. So there's a lot of attempts to associate value with something other than the Wall Street.
Right, and the other area where there's a lot of interesting work, books being written, is valuing companies according to their social utility.
Yeah,
and their consequence. Sir Ronald Cohen, the English entrepreneur, Anglo-Israeli entrepreneur, has just written a book about this. And there's a lot of thinking about how to rethink the very value of companies. And again, in terms of our previous conversation about Google and Facebook, particularly Facebook, imagine if companies were valued according to the impact they had on society. Imagine how the value of Facebook would change.
Well, that's, funnily enough, I think you're inviting me to tell you how much more it would be worth, because I suspect you mean less.
I think less. I mean, given how it seems to be undermining democracy and compounding loneliness and alienation and unhappiness, but that's probably a longer story. Certainly, this issue of long-termism is important. One guy who has always been very good on the long term is Mark Andreessen, and he's in the news this week because he revealed his way in which perhaps he thinks long term because he manages his schedule so well. What's Andreessen revealing this week about the power of his thinking? Very few people are able to see the future more cleanly and clearly than Andreessen, whether you like him or not.
Well, if you've ever been to their office, the waiting area is lined with books, and it's a big waiting area, and there are masses of books. So Mark wants to tell you it's important to read, and he shares that in common with a lot of other people. Bill Gates is a massive reader.
Bezos, I think, as well. Doesn't he require everyone to write half a novel before they present in meetings?
He definitely wants it to be thought through. So, what Andreessen is saying is, if your day is taken up with meeting after meeting after meeting, wall to wall, you have no space to think. You have no space to read. If you can't contemplate and abstract, you can't really act in such a way as to make the future happen. And so his whole focus here, and it's an interview, by the way, with him. It's not something he wrote. He's basically explaining how he carves up his time to be effective at what he does. And he also makes the point that it fails, that he drowns in meetings every now and then and has to reset and go back to carving out time. I do that, by the way. I mean, every morning I read. If you watch this show and you subscribe to the Telegram channel, you'll see that most mornings I add 3 or 4 articles to that Telegram channel that are going to form next week's newsletter. And if I didn't do that reading, I wouldn't really know what was going on. So I carve out time, and my meetings are in other zones of the day. And in the evenings, by the way, as anyone who does business with me will tell you, I don't do business. I sign off. I hang out with my kids and my wife.
Or you just watch Manchester United in the evening.
It's the off season. What can I tell you?
Fantasize about watching. Yeah, well, I just to give a brief plug to my podcast show, Keen On. I read regularly every day because I interview usually a daily interview on Keen On with a new author. So today, for example, I interviewed Martin Sambu of the FT about the economics of belonging, and Kerry Arsenal about Milltown. So so we're good on the reading. A new feature of the week, Keith. This show is definitely a work in progress. Like a startup, is now we have Startup of the Week. Excellent new feature. I think it was a suggestion of one of your Indian viewers. Is that right?
Yeah, Pavan said you should do Startup of the Week. So Pavan, if you're watching or listening, you were successful. This week we have a Startup of the Week. I picked it. The startup's called Grid, and it raised a $12 million Series A from NEA and from a gentleman there called Forrest Baskett. Forrest Baskett is an absolute legend in Silicon Valley. It's a strange name. We can all agree.
Sounds like he comes out of a novel.
But then I'm called Keith Tier, so I can't throw stones. Anyway, Forrest invested in this guy's company, and he wrote a long piece about the process of raising this round of financing. And there's a brilliant section of the piece, I'll put it on screen, called Conviction-Based versus Traction-Based Funding. And anyone who knows me knows this has been a bugbear of mine for many years. I would say it's not an understatement to say I hate traction-based investing. However, to my colleagues who do it, it's not that I hate you. Some of you do a great job and make lots of money from it. It's just not what I like. And I don't like it because it takes all the imagination and historical thinking out of picking startups. Conviction-based investing, on the other hand, forces you to have a belief in what the future might look like and put money behind it before the traction is there. And I prefer that. And this guy is saying that Forrest Baskett is a conviction-based investor and that he failed to get anyone else to agree to fund him. But Forrest Baskett did. He also makes the point that conviction-based investing is almost entirely larger funds, which is because they have more freedom to think. Going back to Andreessen's point about
isn't angel investing, I mean, early stage by definition, conviction, because nobody has any traction when there's just a guy in a garage.
Yeah, absolutely right. Angels are almost always, business angels are a different class. They tend to just be looking for money, but proper angels, people like Ron Conway, a super angel, or Scott Bannister and Sign Bannister, who invest together, or Elad Gil, these people are conviction-based investors. And it's a wonderful thing because you get to try to figure out the future from the present. And what's more fun than that? And to put money behind it. So if you win, you do very, very well. Today I'm about to sign an agreement to become the head of corporate development at Infarm as a part-time role. And Infarm I bet on 5 years ago. And today it's worth somewhere between €500 million and €1 billion. And it's it's not the money side, but it's just fantastic to have seen that potential and then watch it evolve and come to life. There's nothing better. If I'd have waited till now, when InFarm's revenues have reached a certain amount, I wouldn't have been able to do as well from investing in it.
Yeah, but you will admit that you only talk about your victories. We don't hear about all the money you wasted on stuff that you thought was going to turn out to be good, that you had some instinct and it was a disaster and you lost all your money. So it's not for the...
Andrew, you're wrong. I did a panel for the Stanford graduating school, business class school, on failure. And I went through all my failures.
Okay, so very briefly, Keith, what was the dumbest investment you ever made?
The dumbest investment I ever made was putting my own money into real names.
Was that conviction or traction?
It was obsession. Certainly wasn't traction.
That's the third thing.
Yeah, it was obsession. And because a founder should never put their own money into their company. If they can't get a third party to do it, you probably haven't got a good idea.
Well, speaking about putting money into companies, your tweet of the week is not about conviction versus traction, but about the logistics of writing checks for startups. So perhaps you can put the tweet of the week up.
Let's put it up because it's a good one. The tweet of the week is, I'll read it. I could be wrong, but if you're an angel investor who has the means to write a lot of checks, don't drag a pre-seed founder through a Series A-level due diligence for a $1,000 investment. If you love the founder and the team and the opportunity, write the damn check or move on. Yeah,
I saw Mike Arrington retweeted that, and I saw that on Twitter. And what I thought was, are there people really writing $1,000 checks? I mean...
There are. It's one of the received wisdoms in the angel space is you don't have to raise a fund to learn how to invest. You can write small checks and show that you're good at picking companies. And so, that is not terrible advice. And if you get to know founders, a founder will often take a small check from you as part of a bigger round, especially if they want you as an advisor.
But $1,000, I mean...
Yeah,
you can't even buy a cup of tea for that anymore.
I suspect that Jessica Maher, who wrote this, was being a little bit extreme in the numbers she used. But it's just as frustrating if they're writing a $100,000 check, which is a small check in the big picture of things. We've all had investors who become pests because they probably shouldn't be investors because they're too concerned about their investment. And most founders need to be free to build their business without having to over-report to small investors. And so it's just a case of self-awareness, really.
Well, the worst case in this is not so much the money. It's when people change their mind and say, oh, yeah, I'm going to invest, and then they never commit or they don't sign, and then they use some excuse. Does that happen a lot? Yeah,
that's why I thought this was the tweet of the week. A really, really slow no is useless. A slow yes is okay, and a fast no is brilliant. A slow no is the worst of all worlds because it sucks up your time. You've got to service the needs of the investor, and they still get to a no. So as you get older, you start to smell that likelihood, and you don't engage with those investors.
Well, that's true of all sales. You just don't waste your time with people who are kicking the tires.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And it is a seller's market for startups. The seller really, unless they've got a very poor company and idea, the seller is in the driving seat.
Even now?
Oh, very much. Always, because there's such a small number of great investment opportunities. There's lots of companies, but they're not all great investment opportunities. And when you see one, you want to get in, and that's always going to be true.
Well, that was the week that was of September, the week ending September 11th, 2020. It's been a strange year. It's going to get even stranger, I think, with the election coming up. But I think this was the week that tech at least grounded us in something, a week where the sun disappeared quite literally in San Francisco on Wednesday, and where I hope the fires are going to be out for next week when we talk again.
And Andrew, you had the bad taste to wear orange, which was the color of the sky that day.
Yeah, and the color of the hair of our president as well. It's probably one way.
I think it's a very nice neckerchief.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.